What sort of factors do you see affecting the fact that some people get this fragmented access to these higher functions through just from birth, like eidetic or photographic memory and multidexterity and so forth?
I'd say very simplistically that the condition, as I call it, obviously I've got a lot of information out there now, but just to summarize it quickly, and it will sound like rehashed left-right brain stuff, and in many ways it is. I just think we've been looking at it from back to front. It's the information screaming at us. We're just using the wrong piece of kit to look at it. That's all. But basically, what I'm saying is we had at one time, going back quite a long time, an incredibly unique piece of equipment, a consciousness system, a neural system, a brain, whatever you want to call it, with phenomenal capacity compared to what we have now. And of course I'm not, and I say this in almost every interview, I'm not saying we are our brain, we are our neural system, but clearly it has a massive role in facilitating our sense of self. And that piece of equipment was incredibly unique at one time. And it's been degenerating. It's kind of regressed or reverted to a much more basic model, if you like. One side has regressed or reverted much more quickly than the other side, and that just happens to be the side that's currently in charge. So we're kind of running on the least functional side of our brain, and all the while it's claiming and it tells itself it's the most functional, while at the same time we're starved of the very biochemistry we need for this thing to work at all. So that's the essence of the diagnosis. And really, what I'm hoping to do with that is lay it out in such a way that even our deluded rational mind can see this in a language it understands. This to me is a tricky bit. How can we come up with the language that, again, back to that analogy, if we've all got dementia, and let's say one day you wake up and you realize you've got dementia by some pure fluke or miracle or whatever, it's not enough to go, oh my God, I got dementia, oh my God, we've all got dementia and we can fix it, because by definition, stating the obvious isn't going to make any difference. What's the language of dementia? How can you speak in language and reach somebody who's got dementia? Well, if the obvious thing is, of course, it's got to be rational left brain speak, because that's the language of dementia.
Right.
Sorry, I might not have answered your question there. By the way, I think I went off on a bit of a tangent. But ask me the question again, and I'll see if I can answer it this time.
Yeah. What factors do you see that come into play that make the differences that some people simply get this fragmented access to the higher functions simply from birth, that they have eidetic or photographic memory, or they're multidexterous, etc.?
Yeah. Okay, well now I tried to outline the condition a bit itself. So again, this left-right split, the left side quite retarded, the right side still huge capacity but locked away without the necessary build quality, the necessary fuels, the essential actually, it's chronically deficient. So basically that's the basic diagnosis, but the way these two systems interact is highly variable. I think despite what you sometimes read in popular culture, pretty much everybody, with almost no exceptions, is dominated by the left side of their brain, at least when it comes to their everyday sense of self. If you communicate like I am now, if you're speaking, that's left brain, and that's what most of us do. If you happen to sing everything in an operatic style, okay, that's interesting to me, but that doesn't happen very often. So really, to answer your question, I think it's just degrees of. Some people are much more locked into that very rational, absolute sense of certainty that, well, this is all there is, and I know that's all there is because that's all I can see. But again, that's back to self-assessment. Highly questionable if there's even the remotest chance there's a problem with our neural system. And then, of course, right across the spectrum, by degrees, people are aware there are problems. Some people are incredibly sensitive and find it very difficult to cope. And I think that same degree of balance or degree of asymmetry is reflected in the kind of access people have. So accessing some of those superlative skills, although I think they're probably still quite limited, is usually a sign of having more access to the right hemisphere. That's all. And often, especially in the case of some of the savant-like abilities, there's often quite tangible evidence of what might be considered even greater dysfunction in the left hemisphere. So there's often some of the skills that we think are normal becoming even more dysfunctional. But hand in hand with that, what I've proposed is that the ability of the rational mind, the left brain, to stay in charge also becomes weaker, and some of these other traits start to leak through. They're often quite fragmented, but phenomenally impressive. I think when you compare some of the abilities that humans display in those cases, they're not just a little bit better. They're not compensation. They're not, well, one system's broken, this is compensating. They're 10, 100, 1,000 times better. And it doesn't make any sense that we'd have these abilities locked away when clearly the wiring is there somewhere. Of course, hand in hand with being able to feel phenomenally amazing. I mean, why do humans have the capacity to feel astoundingly, wonderfully amazing, and yet it's quite tricky to have those experiences? What on earth is going on there? And why are we so content to put up with what is relatively incredibly depressed and mundane? What on earth are we doing? But yeah, I think to reiterate, that's the answer to that question. It's degrees of balance between the hemispheres, and also some other factors to do with specific kinds of damage that can occur to the left hemisphere, allowing access, particular birth sort of development environments. There's a lot of variation there, so I'd expect a spectrum, quite a wide spectrum of what might be called symptoms. Some people absolutely bulletproof, nailed down, utterly convinced that what they see is what there is. And then at the other extreme, a great awareness that there's a complete madness going on, and there's all sorts of things that some people just are blind to. And these traits go hand in hand with that. More creative, more access to these states. They tend to go hand in hand, not always, but most of the time.
Right. For sure. Do you see the whole matter of when humans started to migrate everywhere, that our breeding with Neanderthal and Denisovan, who were already in a long period of degeneration, that perhaps accelerated our own degeneration even further?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think it's possible. I mean, in some ways, without sounding too harsh or judgmental, because I think humanity is in a terrible state, and I'm hardly the first person to come up with that conclusion. It's, again, another philosophical point. It's intriguing to me, at least, that throughout recorded history, some of the most intelligent and creative people, and of course currently as well, have been absolutely clear in their view that humanity is clinically insane. And they don't mean this as a joke. They don't mean this as some kind of metaphorical quip. They're deadly serious. And why on earth we're marching along the same path when incredibly intelligent people, and not just one or two, many people, and today, of course, many people feel the same way, have that view. You'd think if we were remotely sane, we'd immediately put the brakes on and go, okay, what's going on here? Of course, if we were completely insane, we'd just keep marching in the same direction. But anyway, that's digressing slightly. Back to the point with Neanderthals. I kind of use Neanderthals as an example of where we have been heading for some time. Neanderthals, it seems, fit the same primate pattern. That obviously, in the distant past, they were forest dwelling, and they ended up in quite harsh environments, and they survived. This isn't a question of survival necessarily, but no doubt lost all that forest biochemistry, that forest ecology, and I think degenerated in the same way we have been doing for perhaps a longer period of time. And again, it's not about survival. We are clever enough to survive. I'm talking about optimal function here. So any sort of crossbreeding, yes, it might have had the capacity, particularly in the maternal line, because I have a lot of interest in this sort of development in the uterus and the hormonal regime and the dietary regime and so on. So any meetings of different lineages of primates where one lineage had been degenerating for much longer, it could result in things not helping, shall we say. But genetically, the kind of basic genetics, I don't think that's really the problem, because I think so much of what we've lost isn't about a genetic loss. It's about the biochemistry. It's about how the genes were read, how the DNA was read. So yes, I think that it could have had a negative impact, but I think it's kind of, humans I think have been in trouble for a very long time. All the traditions, they don't say, yeah, things were fantastic till about 50 years ago or 500 years ago or 10,000 years ago. The traditions seem to imply ages of mankind, very long periods of time. And I'd concur. I think we've been in trouble for a long time. I think the condition is getting worse and it's accelerating almost as we watch. But I think we've been in trouble for a long time. And I suspect the end of the expansion of our neocortex, the modern part of our brain, when that stopped expanding, it expanded at an incredible rate according to the information we have. When that expansion suddenly stopped, I think that's the smoking gun. Something changed then, and current evidence, of course, it may change, but that sort of puts it in the window of roughly 200,000 years ago when this phenomenal expansion suddenly stopped, and then there's been a slight shrinkage. So we're at the wrong end of a very long process, and I think our meetings with other primates came much later on and probably hasn't had a huge impact, to be honest.
Yeah, as a left brain counteract, what you say if it was true that we have neurological degeneration for a long time, that what hope we today would have to hold and reverse this if our ancestors who were much more functional couldn't manage that?
Mm-hmm. That's a worrying question, and I think it's a very good question. Well, I think there is cause to be potentially optimistic anyway, particularly because I see this condition as being very asymmetric. It's like we have two systems now. I think at one time they were the same system, a phenomenal system, and it's because of this asymmetric reversion to type, we now have two systems, one severely dysfunctional that thinks it's amazing, and then one with much more function but locked away and starved of all the necessary components and so on. So I think we have the potential to make a fairly rapid shift to a much more functional state. I don't think that's the end of the journey, and I think where that could be achieved, where our ancestors, I mean, you say they failed, and I'd agree. We wouldn't be having this conversation if they had succeeded. But I think they left some phenomenal clues if we can only interpret them correctly. I mean, one of the challenges I lay down is that if you step back, forget the dogma and the beliefs, and remember beliefs are very much left brain, and you step back from what all these traditions mean to us as individuals and our identity and so on, and in particular look at the practices and techniques, and of course possibly taking on board some of the traditions that these religious approaches were based on. And if you look at them as treatments, I would say that for the most part they fall into three simple categories. There's the basic engineering, the sort of molecular re-engineering. They call it, we today call it diet and food. Completely stupid words for some of the most advanced molecular engineering that is in the known universe. Our neural system is incredibly, amazingly complex. And of course, we're in charge of building it, and we build it from what we call food. Well, of course, the stuff we eat today has got absolutely no relationship whatsoever to what it used to be built from. And the ancient traditions do talk about this. They talk about returning to a sort of natural diet, and some traditions are even more explicit. The sort of Judaic-Christian tradition, the sort of Genesis story, which is quite possibly a much older story, is quite specific. It talks about fruit and leaves. Quite astounding when you think that modern science effectively concurs with that, at least in terms of our evolutionary origins. So I think we have a big piece of the jigsaw there. Then you look at some of these other practices, which again I'm calling treatments. They seem to fall into two camps, surprise, surprise. One bunch of treatments are about trying to inhibit the effects of the left hemisphere. So sort of the Trappist tradition, not speaking, because left hemisphere is speech dominant, the kind of meditative approaches and so on and so forth, and even reducing sleep. Is a simple idea. If we have two consciousness systems, one's very inefficient but in charge, and it's got weak batteries, and it needs to recharge very regular or it loses control. Okay, so you starve it of its recharge time, and yes, it doesn't like it, and you feel terrible, and you're grumpy, and you're irritable, and you become dysfunctional. But if you stay with that long enough, its ability to stay in control begins to slip away. Okay, so a whole bunch of techniques there to limit the effects of the side of our brain that isn't working too well, and hand in hand with that, techniques that can stimulate and re-engage the latent ability in the right hemisphere. So effectively our sense of self begins to migrate from, if you see the hemispheres or each side of the brain as a kind of musical instrument, and our sense of self is the music, currently we're playing through a very distorted and damaged instrument. That's all we know. We think it's normal. But if you can manage to switch sides and the music plays through an instrument that may not be perfect anymore, but it's in much better shape, oh my God, the sound is divine, or the experience is divine. Well, those traditions tell us an awful lot about how to approach this problem. Did they have a complete answer? Possibly not. But they give us a lot of clues. And I think putting all those in the same place and using them in combination, and then possibly on top of that, using some of the technology we've created. I mean, most of our technology is insane and is highly self-destructive, or we use it to build weapons to kill each other and so on. But within that complete mayhem, there are bits of equipment and approaches that may give us an edge in terms of being able to manage this condition, treat it, and ultimately come up with a fix. So I think it could be done. It's whether there really is a condition. That's the question I'm asking. Then do we want to do anything about it? I mean, if it turns out a neural system's badly compromised, and this isn't anybody's fault, is it remotely sane to go, okay, well, we just continue with that then? Or would the sane option be, hang on a minute, if we've got phenomenal capacity locked away, and even our ideas of phenomenal capacity, even our ideas of advanced and so on, are up for question because they've all come out of our rational mind. Our rational mind has all sorts of ideas about what humans are. I mean, even the very label human beings, we live in a world of labels, concepts, and what we should be. There may be a piece of equipment inside of us that can experientially tell us who and what we are, at least a lot more accurately than we currently have. And all these traditions say that, and people still have these experiences. So is it possible to put a formula together that can at least shift us into a state where we have a bit more access, we're a bit more sane or a bit less insane? That to me would be a good starting point. I mean, I certainly wouldn't, even if the proposal I put forward turns out to be somewhere near the mark, at this stage I'd say the sensible thing to do isn't to rush ahead and come up with finite conclusions, say, how can we access more function? Then we might figure out the right questions to ask, and let alone come up with the answers. That to me makes sense. So that's where I think we can start, bootstrapping ourselves a step at a time, doing a rebuild, putting in place the practices that can give us more access to equipment that works better and has a much higher cognitive function, much more intelligent, much more aware, and begin then asking the questions and, of course, trying to come up with answers. At this stage, I'm really just interested, are we in the middle of a huge train wreck? And, of course, that train wreck is us. Is it possible to put the brakes on before it's too late? That's all I'm interested in at this stage. The idea that there's complete answers, I think, would be far too premature. But I'm certainly convinced we have enough latent capacity to begin putting ourselves back on track, to begin asking the right questions, and to begin coming up with solutions. The kind of capacity that we see in prodigious geniuses, savants, and so on, I think that's locked away in pretty much all of us. And I think it might be quite simple, relatively speaking, to begin accessing that. And that's where I think we can start reversing the decline, by having the insights, coming up with appropriate questions, and coming up with answers beyond the wildest capability of our so-called advanced rational mind. It wouldn't come up with anything novel and new. It just thinks more of the same is a good idea.
Yeah. Do you see that some individuals being, sort of speaking, so far gone that they just can't grasp anything more than what their rational or irrational left brain is telling them?
Yes, I think at one extreme that is very real, and ironically, I think there's a correlation between the condition that exhibits itself in that, or the symptoms in that sort of the way it exhibits in that way, tend to be people who are most frightened and most driven to take control. So we've ended up with society and civilization increasingly built on a hierarchy of madness. I think I'm generalizing a little bit, but I also think it's pretty obvious to a lot of people. And I'm talking about people who really want to be in control. I'm not talking about people who are brilliant at what they do and end up in control. That's a different matter altogether, mostly anyway. But yes, I think we've ended up, our society and culture has been guided by some of the most deluded and dysfunctional people around. And I think when you're so dominated by such a limited perspective, and of course, this isn't anybody's fault, but by definition, people are blind to anything else because the equipment cannot see anything else. It's not that they're being bloody minded necessarily. It's like they've got a black and white TV and you're on the phone saying, "Hey, can you see how amazing the colors are?" And they're looking at the TV and going, "What you on about? I can't see anything." It's that simple. They cannot see it. But I think it's possible to lay out enough rationally understandable. It's got to be in the language of the left brain. It's got to be concepts rather than experience. So if you can, metaphorically speaking, if you can take an X-ray to somebody or something like that and say, "Look, here's the damage in this part of your brain. Can you see it?" If it's that simple, and they go, "Well, I can't. I feel fine," but they see the damage. Or maybe a better analogy, one I've used before. If the patient is in a hospital and they're recovering from serious injury, but they have no idea they've got serious injury because the injury is to their brain, and they're convinced they're absolutely fine, which cases like that do exist. In fact, that's part of what the left hemisphere does, in a milder way. But if you can then get that person to sit down and watch CCTV footage of their car crashing into a concrete pillar and then being taken out by the paramedics, and they can clearly see it's them. If you can provide some kind of mechanism like that where it becomes obvious even though they can't feel anything, there's a possibility then, I think, of challenging the rational mind's absolute belief that everything's fine. Maybe it's not possible, but that's what I think is possible. And I've certainly seen that in microcosm, where I've just pointed people to existing data, because I haven't done this research. I'm just one of the things that I say a lot is I'm making a pretty bold claim here. I'm saying humans have got a serious neurological condition, very serious, and it's resulted in severe perceptual problems. Now, if that really is the case, there would have to be a mountain of evidence. We'd be swimming in the evidence. We just wouldn't have seen it because we've got the condition. However, once you keep making that point and encourage people to start asking that question, or in the tradition of debating, let's imagine for a minute we've all got serious brain damage. What would the world look like? How would our relationships be? What would we be doing? And then it becomes much less of a leap. It becomes quite uncomfortable very immediately. It's like, oh my God, this is exactly how we'd behave if one half of our brain was toast and it was running the show. It's that simple. But that's not what we've been brought up to ask. And of course, it's uncomfortable for some people to ask. But I think if you lay it out like that and you present the modern neurological literature that's really good, I think the literature is very good. The conclusions, of course, by definition must be suspect. But where you have information, you have data. Again, I'm looking again at the left brain, and the accepted evidence is it lies, it's deluded, it cannot perceive reality. Oh, and by the way, it's in charge. If we were remotely sane, we'd all stop immediately and go, holy shit, there's something wrong here. And the evidence is there. It's staring us in the bloody face. But of course, we're using the same piece of equipment, looking at the evidence going, oh yeah, it's fine because this is specialized adaptation and everything's cool. No way. I don't know if that makes sense. It makes sense to me, but I'm probably as deluded as everyone else. So.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to me.
But I think that's an interesting game to play. And again, there should be no fear in asking these questions. If we're sane and everything's functional, we should be very happy to check in, ask these questions, give ourselves a clean bill of health. But we should be willing to ask the questions. So it shouldn't be a problem at all to imagine, well, let's imagine what it would be like. How would we experience ourselves and each other, and what kind of world would we live in if our left hemisphere was badly damaged and in charge? What would it look like? And that there should be no challenge in that at all. There should be no evidence in the neurological literature. There should be no missing ecology from the forest, something I make clear in the book. There would be no traditions, universal traditions that humans were going stark raving bonkers. Now, individually, you might be able to explain away any one of these pieces of the jigsaw, but the very fact they all exist and they're all telling us the same story, and also telling us that we're going to find it hard to see it and experience it, that's pretty damn weird that exists. I mean, is it proof? Possibly not. But my God, it's damn weird that it exists.
Yes, definitely it is. Have you seen it increasingly getting picked up by the academics that they're incorporating this data into their own area of expertise, like neurochemistry or anthropology or primatology and so forth?
Not yet. I'd say it's early days. What I did do, I've done it at different stages, but once the sort of manuscript was done, and in many ways I'd love to rewrite the whole manuscript because there's so much new information, but it's not that I feel the original manuscript's flawed in any way. I could just provide so much more data, but even that original outline I'm pretty happy with. And of course, I wanted to test the water. I wanted to send copies to people to see if see what reaction I got. And obviously, bearing in mind, I must have this condition. Of course, I have this condition. I could have been off on some complete tangent and completely insane. So I sent copies and various summaries to different people. And it struck me quite early on, I didn't need to send it to hundreds of people because the proposal I made so extreme relative to what most people expect, and the mechanisms are quite simple if you have a background in the appropriate sciences. I really only needed a bit of feedback from a number of people in different disciplines. That was all, and that initial feedback has been phenomenally good, way better than I expected. I was hoping that maybe some respected academics might say, okay, well, it's a bit unusual, but it might be worth looking at. I've had responses that again, for academics, they're usually conservative, kind of almost eulogies going along the lines of wow, this is phenomenal, this could turn everything upside down. So that was enough to tell me that being able to perceive the information as evidence that we're highly advanced, or the same information can be perceived as we're highly degenerate, the fact a few other people agree with that possibility, that was enough. I thought, well, okay, I'm not completely crazy here, or all crazy, of course, but it makes sense. So really those initial responses of, again, provided me with a lot of drive and impetus to keep going with this. Of course, the next stage, which is what I hope is going on at the moment, is to reach a much wider audience and really initiate debate. There's no way humanity can have a severe neurological condition, and once we start focusing on that question, it will not be possible to escape from that conclusion unless it doesn't exist. Of course, people will have hostile responses. I mean, most of the hostile responses I get are from people who've either not read the book or can't be bothered to look at the material and so on. They just go, this is a crazy idea because it's not the accepted idea, which of course it wouldn't be. Anybody who's actually bothered to look at the book and done a bit of reading around and looked at some of the extra information, that's when it starts to get interesting, because it suddenly isn't so easy to go, oh, this is some kind of bullshit crazy idea. It's like, oh my god, actually this does start to make sense. So that's all I'm really trying to do at this stage, is initiate debate, but serious debate. And again, if anybody wants to dismiss a new theory, to do it justice, they have to understand it. Of course, a lot of people don't bother to try and understand it. They just dismiss it at a very superficial level. But if you bother to at least attempt to make the theory work, and there should be no risk in that, and then come away and go, well, it's complete rubbish because of this, and this, absolutely fine, that's what I'm looking for. But for the most part, I'd say the majority of reaction for people who've bothered to read it, understand it, is incredibly positive. It's like, oh my god, this makes so much sense. And of course it's so obvious. It's been staring us in the face forever, as it would have had to have been. It's not something that would have, we couldn't have got to this point with a serious condition without there being a debris trail going back hundreds and thousands of years. Whether it's our collective behavior, well, hey ho, anybody who tries to claim that humans are remotely sane, I'm not interested anymore, and if that's pig-headed, I don't care. We're doing a damnedest to destroy ourselves and where we live. Clearly insane. So our collective behavior is an absolute no-brainer. And then, as I say, we have all these traditions in all various formats, and they all pretty much talk about humanity sliding into primitive behavior, delusion. Well, we all understand the word delusion, but how do we know if we're deluded? Really simple stuff.
Yeah.
And then are there mechanisms? Is there a smoking gun here? Well, the orthodox science supports the idea of an incredibly unique origin, incredibly unique, and it's echoed in these ancient traditions. And the incredibly unique origin was a symbiotic relationship with the reproductive organs of a whole other kingdom. Okay, that's what we formed a symbiotic relationship with. Now, I know enough about plant sciences, and I don't know a huge amount. I know enough that that's an incredibly unique symbiotic relationship. We're ingesting the sex organs of a whole other kingdom, and those sex organs are loaded with all sorts of complex biochemistry and hormonally active compounds that evolved to read DNA differently. That's enough for me. It's enough to go, there's something worth looking at here. Of course we can pick it apart. Of course we can look at it and go, well, actually maybe it doesn't fit. But there's enough of a smoking gun that points to me very powerfully in the direction that really our first priority here should be to give ourselves a clean bill of health. Well, a lot of people are worried about what on earth's going on and the massive damage we're doing and etc., etc. That isn't going to change if we've got a problem in our neural system, and we should be able to figure that out. We should be able to stop and go, okay, is there a problem with our consciousness system, our neural system? If there isn't, fine. We've got to look at our behavior in another way. If there is a problem, that's surely got to be our absolute priority, because everything else is going to go to shit.
Yeah, for sure. Have you looked at the possibility that perhaps our lineage wasn't the last one to break apart from the fruit symbiosis, and maybe there was some lineages that went on even further and maybe became even more advanced but have died out long time ago?
I suppose it's possible, but I'm not aware of any evidence that would support that. In principle, it could be possible. I suspect, and I don't mean this in an arrogant way, the evidence will emerge or it won't, but I suspect what we call ourselves humans, and I suspect it was a gradation of speciation rather than the distinct lineages we normally talk about. I think we basically, in a very literal and metaphorical way, there was a hothouse effect in the forest, where the plant biochemistry was having a massive impact on the way we developed and the structures we evolved and so on, just because of the complex biochemistry. And all the while there were refugees, if you like, lineages that were isolated from the forest, became separated, and they evolved in the wrong way. But I suspect there was a final sort of shrinking of the forests and whatever lineages were left. And it may just have been humans, possibly Neanderthals at a slightly earlier stage. It looks to me like they were the last two out of the forest. And by when I say out of the forest, I mean breaking that symbiotic relationship. Because, of course, some primates still live in the forest. We've got the great apes, the gorillas, the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the orangutans. It's not necessarily about staying in the forest. It's about this symbiotic relationship breaking down. If it breaks down, that's when the problems start. If the forest recovers and the obligate tree dwellers, the primates that are still more adapted to tree living, recolonize the forest, maybe they survived in gallery forest along the rivers and so on, that's not enough to start this mechanism again. So once it breaks down, that's it, it's broken down. Putting the forest back, eating fruit again, it will slow things down, it will help, but it will not start that process again. So I come back to the point earlier. I think the smoking gun for me at the moment is the evidence from the fossil record, and of course it's limited, it's not complete, and forests or tropical forests are incredibly bad at leaving fossils. But I think the smoking gun is this accelerating curve when our neocortex in particular was expanding at a phenomenal rate, and it's very expensive to build, very expensive to run, and to survive. Quite clearly, the fossil record tells us, or the species we see today, we do not need a huge neural system to survive. It's got nothing to do with survival. Something else was going on there. But I think that window when that expansion stopped, I think that's the clue. And humans certainly seem to fit that bill as possibly being the last of that lineage coming out of there. But yes, there could have been others, and we've yet to find evidence of them. That is possible.
Right, there's no telling how much we are missing, because it's like when they first discovered the piece of bone finger from a Denisovan, and that started the whole new area of discussion on that, and this day they still don't have any idea what exactly, how do they look like, how do their faces formed, and all they know is what from that bone discovery, and so far that they've habited anywhere from Siberia up to Southeast Asia for huge areas. And yeah, there's so much we don't know.
Well, I agree, particularly when it comes to the fossil record. It's in many ways a very weak link, but so far it doesn't contradict the idea. As I say, that this particular weak area is if our origins or this very unique symbiotic relationship, the only place that can occur is the non-seasonal tropical forest. Not even the seasonal tropical forest, that wouldn't sustain it. The only place you can get fruit 24/7 for millions of years is a non-seasonal tropical forest. By definition, it's wet, and whether we've looked there, but also by its very nature, fossils aren't very easily preserved there or made there. So I think the fossil record is weak. But I'm looking at the whole picture, and if you lay all the pieces out, that there is this pattern there. It's like, okay, any individual piece has maybe 20 explanations. Put two pieces together, the number of explanations starts to drop. If you put them all in the same place, it starts to look quite compelling. There's something going on here, and it's quite challenging. It's back to this idea that the real problem we have is between our ears. And all these ancient traditions said that, and some of them were very, they came from a very sort of wise perspective, and they certainly didn't make the kind of mess we're making now. And it seems to be, I'd invite anybody and everybody, including skeptical academics, to revisit the standard left-right brain literature. Forget the current conclusions, just look at the evidence, look at the data, and what the hemispheres individually, what they contribute. That's all. Now, it's not the whole picture, but it's shocking. If you step back and look at that with eyes fresh, without the current thinking, and as I say, that should be enough to alarm us. The perceptually dominant piece of equipment for all of us has some incredibly bizarre characteristics, and they seem to fit very much with this idea of sociopathic, psychopathic, paranoid, frightened, need to be in control, very limited function, pretty stupid, etc., etc. We all have this. I have this. It's not very comfortable, but if that's what's really going on, then we need to embrace that. We need to accept that and start informing our decisions based on the fact that we might have a serious problem between our ears, and trying to look for solutions out there isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, definitely.